Welcome to part 3 in this ongoing series about the clash between the Spaniards and the Mexica Empire. There will be 4 parts to this series, so by the time you'll be done with this episode, you will be 75% through the whole thing. So, unless you don't mind jumping into the middle of a story, probably is a good idea to start out with part 1 and 2 in this series. And while you are at it, if you want to, you can check out also a prequel that's only available at the website historyonfirepodcast.com. It's not essential to understanding the story, but it was a really fun story to research and narrate, and it takes place about 100 years before the arrival of the Spaniards, so it helps set the context. In any case, when we left off last time at the end of part 2, after a few days of brutal fighting, Spaniards and Tlaxcalans had agreed to stop killing each other and decided to join forces instead. The Mexica Emperor Moctezuma was not too happy about it. He had been hoping that the Tlaxcalans would wipe out the Spaniards, since he himself didn't know how to handle them, and he was also hoping that the Tlaxcalans would be weakened enough by this fight so that he could come in and take them out. In other words, his hope was that these two people, both of whom he didn't like, he didn't like the Spaniards, he didn't like the Tlaxcalans, he was hoping that they would just kill each other. But that's not the way it worked out. So, disturbed by the news of the Spanish victory and their subsequent alliance with the Tlaxcalans, Moctezuma tried to put on a good face by sending messengers congratulating Cortés for the victory over his enemies, and also trying to convince Cortés not to ally himself with what Moctezuma considered the traitorous Tlaxcalans. He said, you don't trust them, they are tricky people, all of that kind of stuff. Ignoring Moctezuma's advice, Cortés entered Tlaxcala on September 18, 1519, along with the entire Spanish force, as well as their Totonac allies, who had been fighting side by side with them over the last few days. The Totonacs, I haven't really mentioned that much over this last period during the conflict with Tlaxcalans, but they have been incredibly helpful. In the words of a Spaniard in this expedition, had it not been for them, we should not have won. So clearly the alliance with the Totonacs had already paid dividends. The Spaniards could use the morale boost that took place now after getting a few days of R&R in Tlaxcala. Helping their morale was the fact that the noble lords of the city decide to hand them 300 slave girls, which the Spaniards always appreciated. Plus, they were also trying to set up some of the Spanish captains to marry the daughters of some of the nobility in town. Some of these daughters were handed to the Spanish captains so that they would marry and kind of cement an alliance between these two peoples. The hope of the Tlaxcalan lords was that the Spaniards would marry their daughters. Kind of didn't work out that way. The Spaniards ended up taking them more as concubines than actual full-fledged wives. But initially there's ambiguity about it, so they just say, okay, we'll baptize them, and then we will marry them, whatever, something. And again, the line between real marriage and becoming a concubine wasn't entirely clear in the customs between the two people, so nobody seemed to take offense at this. For example, even the daughter, or at least one of the daughters of one of the key leaders in Tlaxcala, Xicotenga the Elder, was given to the captain Pedro de Alvarado and took on the name Doña Luisa. In the months to come, not surprisingly, quite a few mestizo kids born from this union of native women and Spanish men were born. I said born about twice in that very short sentence, didn't I? In any case, ignore it. I'm an Italian phobe, what can I say? You get the message. One of the things that happened that was interesting was that Cortés asked the Tlaxcalans to give up human sacrifice and to give up the worship of their gods. The leaders in Tlaxcala just begged him not to push that point, since they were really not ready for it, and they told him, we would rather die than give them up. So wisely, the Spaniards decided to let it go, and demonstrating an attitude that was quite uncommon during these times, a friar told Cortés, "It would not be right to make them Christians by force." This is clearly an unusual sentiment in the 1500s, but, Cortés decided to agree with it, which is even more unusual. So for the time being, the Spaniards decided not to press the issue of human sacrifice, even though they did free some captives, both men and women were destined for sacrifice, but they didn't try to abolish human sacrifice as a whole, or force the Tlaxcalans to give up their old religion. But in between these trading women and challenging one another's theologies, the Tlaxcalans gave Cortés lots of information about the layout of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica capital, and about the Mexica Empire as a whole. Some of the information was very useful, some of it was kind of made up. For example, they told Cortés that in the past giants used to live there, and they show Cortés what seemed to be proof of what they were saying. They showed him this giant femur bone who was as tall as a human being. But modern historians believe that this was not the femur of an actual human, this was the femur of a mammoth. These were mammoth bones, since the whole Valley of Mexico was one big archaeological park where thousands upon thousands of mammoths had died. More to the point, now Mexica ambassadors arrived to visit Cortés, and they invited him to say, "Okay, great that you made peace with the Tlaxcalans, but now, on your way, since you insist on coming to Tenochtitlan to visit our emperor, would you mind first stopping at Cholula?" Cholula was a city that had been an ally of the Tlaxcalans, but had recently switched to the Mexica side of the conflict. And in case I didn't make that clear already, Tlaxcalans and Mexica hated each other. So the Tlaxcala now headed for Cholula. They were not too happy about the fact that they saw it as a betrayal. The Tlaxcala don't like the sound of this suggestion that the Spaniards should go through Cholula. Their standard policy was, whatever the Mexica want, we're gonna do the opposite. So if the Mexica say go to Cholula, then to the Tlaxcalans that meant you should go anywhere in the world except Cholula. So they told Cortés to avoid Cholula, since the people there were loyal to the Mexica. And while Cortés listened to them politely, he made it clear that he had his own plans, and going to Cholula was part of them. Tlaxcalans were less than thrilled with this, but, they were puzzled, but they were willing to give it a chance. After all, the Spaniards seemed weird and powerful in odd ways, so who knows, maybe there was some logic to what Cortés was saying. So they sent about 1,000 Tlaxcalan warriors to go with Cortés and the Spaniards toward Cholula. Nobody knows exactly what Cortés was thinking in heading out toward Cholula. It's possible that he was going there to crash the city, or at least make sure they would be loyal, since one of the problems with the geography of the Valley of Mexico is that if Cortés were to make his way to Tenochtitlan without having resolved a situation in Cholula, it would be problematic because Cholula could threaten his line of communication with Veracruz. He would stand in between Cortés heading toward Tenochtitlan and the coast from which he came. So he wanted to fix things, one thing or another. This idea of having a possibly hostile city in the Spanish forces rear, that was not something that Cortés was comfortable with. Either way, figuring out things with Cholula was not a bad idea. In the meantime, a couple of captains, including Alvarado and Vasquez de Tapia were sent forward to explore the path toward Tenochtitlan. The Tlaxcalan, as they are getting to Cholula, the Tlaxcalan again warn Cortés that it's likely that they would be ambushed there, that the Cholulans would block the streets and use rocks from the roofs and do all these terrible things. Alvarado's Tlaxcalan mistress told him that a little more, because so far you have the Tlaxcalan just spreading rumors about the Cholulans, and Cortés is listening, but up to a point. A little more worrisome is the fact that Alvarado's Tlaxcalan mistress told him that one of the Tlaxcalan commanders wasn't so fond of suddenly being buddy-buddy with the Spaniards. He probably was still a bit sore from a few days earlier when the Spaniards were mowing down Tlaxcalan warriors in battle, setting villages to the torch, and freeing Tlaxcala spies, but not before removing a few limbs from their bodies. So, the idea of making peace with the Spaniards had rubbed him the wrong way, and apparently he was ready to conspire with the Cholulans against the Spaniards. To avoid this scenario, but also trying not to make a big deal out of it, Cortés had him secretly strangled, and, so you can put an X on this guy and whatever his plans were. So it turns out this was quite useful pillow talk between Alvarado and this Tlaxcalan mistress. When they arrived at Cholula, the inhabitants of the city welcomed the Spaniards, but they asked that the Tlaxcalans not be allowed to enter the city, because by now they were enemies with one another. Cortés said, fine, no problem. The Totonacs, however, did go with the Spaniards. They entered Cholula, and apparently they were all welcome there. During the initial meeting, Cortés, as usual, tried to convince them to give up their gods. As usual, the locals refuse. But at least they seem okay with the idea of swearing obedience to the Spanish king. The Spaniards are given a lot of food and lodging in the city. Cholula was no small provincial village. It is said that the city had been inhabited for possibly 1,000 years. They had one of the very largest pyramids in the whole world, and some estimates suggest that it may have had up to 200,000 people living there. Some people suggest this estimate may be a bit inflated. In any case, this was a big place. It was a very, very large city. According to some sources, but again, it's very hard to figure out the truth, Moctezuma had secretly sent 20,000 warriors close to Cholula ready to attack the Spaniards. And he had asked the Cholulans to trap the Spaniards there, and then, if everything went well, they could keep 20 of them to sacrifice to the gods. Keep in mind, this is highly speculative. Some people say that this is what happened, other people say no, it's very unlikely that this took place. Nobody knows for sure. In any case, after a couple of days of hanging out in Cholula, the Spaniards began to notice a mood change. Food was not forthcoming anymore. During the negotiations, one of the Cholula leaders let it slip out that Moctezuma had ordered that they would not give any more food to the Spaniards, and that the Spaniards should not be allowed to go to Tenochtitlan. The Totonacs came in around this time and whispered in Cortés' ear, saying, look, the Tlaxcalans may be right. The inhabitants here are planning to attack. We have found holes in some of the streets that have been covered with wood, but there were pits there with stakes planted so that Spanish horses would just trip over them and get impaled there. Some Tlaxcalans also make their way into the city and tell Cortés, and I quote here, "Be careful, for this city is hostile. We know that they sacrificed last night to their god of war. They offered him 7 persons, 5 of them children, so that he should give them victory over you. and we have seen them moving all their baggage and women out of the city. So this is clearly, if this is true, this is worrisome stuff. Cortés replied to the Tlaxcalans with the words they had wanted to hear. Cortés' message to them is get ready. In one of his usual strategic lies, Cortés told the Cholulans that he was planning to leave, so if they could please provide 2,000 warriors for the trip. The Cholulans were only too happy, because they figured they could catch the Spaniards between their own 2,000 warriors and the Mexica forces that were supposedly nearby. Remember the lady we discussed in episode 2, Malintzin, sometimes referred to as La Malinche? I mentioned how important she was, and yet, some of the primary sources, they all insist on what a big role she played during the whole expedition, and yet they tell us so little about her. Well, this is one of the cases where they do tell us about her. The story goes that she visited with some of the local people, the inhabitants of the city, and that the wife of a local leader took a liking to her, and so she warned Malintzin to stay away from the Spaniards, since they will soon be killed in their sleep. She told her to, forget the Spaniards, come to my house instead, and you can then become my daughter-in-law. You can marry my son, but please stay away from the Spaniards. It's not a good idea. And, I know all this because my husband is a captain and they are preparing their move. Malintzin supposedly played the role pretending to have zero loyalty to the Spaniards, that yes, she was down with this plan, and she just said, look, I need to return to the Spanish camp to collect all my belongings, and then I'll be right back. But what she did instead is return to the Spanish camp and tell everything to Cortés. If she hadn't, the whole story could change here. Things could have gone very differently. Cortés, however, had the woman who had suggested this plan to Malintzin arrested, and the Spaniards now are beginning to notice that just as the Tlaxcalan warned, some of the streets were being closed, and stones were being piled along the roofs of many of the buildings. So Cortés decided it's high time to sort the truth from gossip, and in a move that would have greatly pleased Dick Cheney to no end, he invited some Cholulan priests to visit, he tied them up, and he had them tortured to interrogate them. The priests promptly spilled the beans. Torture tend to have that effect on people. So they started talking real fast, and they told Cortés that the Mexica were planning on they told them to set up this ambush. They told them to sacrifice some of the Spaniards. That, this whole thing had been ordered by Moctezuma. And that also they added that Moctezuma kept changing his mind. One moment he wanted to make peace with the Spaniards, one moment he wanted to wipe them out, and apparently this was one of the moments when he wanted to wipe them out. So Cortés consulted with his captains about what to do next. And what they decide to do, and what they will do, is that the next morning, which by now is mid-October, they invite most of the lords of the city in the courtyard of the temple of Quetzalcoatl, so that they could greet them before they left town. About 100 of the main lords came in. Cortés, in the meantime, keep in mind, some of the Mexica messengers that had come from Moctezuma were still in town. Cortés took them aside, and he told them, I quote, "These people wanted to kill me, and they say that Moctezuma was behind it. But I do not believe it, because I hold him as a friend, and know that he's a great lord, and the Lord does not lie. I believe they wanted to do me this injury by treachery, as scoundrels that they are, and people who have no lord. And for this they shall die. But you have nothing to fear, for beside being messengers, you are the envoys of the Lord I regard as friend, who I have reason to believe is very good, and nothing will I hear to the contrary. Is this a gangster speech or what? I mean, this is Cortés in his classic good cop, bad cop. He's telling them, I have to punish these bad Cholulans, but you have nothing to worry about, because I know you're loyal and your emperor Moctezuma is a good guy. He's clearly just giving them a warning. But he's couching it in this good cop speech. So after this good cop speech, he's going to deliver some very bad cop action, sending a not subtle message to Moctezuma in voice. In the words of Bernal Diaz, though it was early when the Cholulan warriors arrived, we were already quite prepared for what had to be done. Soldiers with swords and shields were stationed at the gate of the great court, so as not to let a single armed Indian escape. So what happened is the Spaniards closed the doors, closed many of the entrances to the area. Cortés gave the signal, and the Spaniards attacked. They killed all of the 100 lords who had come to meet them, plus many more people who were close to the courtyard. By now the Tlaxcalans stormed into the town. The Totonacs also started sacking the town. So the Tlaxcalans attacking from outside the city, they managed to enter and start pillaging left and right. Many of the high priests threw themselves from the top of the pyramids. They jumped rather than being captured. It's hard to call it a battle, because really only one side was armed and fighting, but this leads to a couple of days of pillaging the city. It's estimated that somewhere between low estimates suggest 3,000 people, high estimates suggest 30,000 people were killed at this time, depending on which sources you listen to. Making clear that he was the new sheriff in town, Cortés now picked the new leader of Cholula. After killing pretty much everybody else, he had an easy time saying, anybody disagree with the guy I pick? Clearly nobody did. Upon hearing what happened, and again, this according to some sources, we don't know if it's 100% true or not, but supposedly upon hearing what happened, the Mexica army that was stationed a few miles from Cholula fled. At least that's what is believed by those historians who believe that there was a Mexica army. Some are not so sure about it. Bernal Diaz wrote that he heard from a good source that Moctezuma, upon receiving this news, panicked and shut himself in for 2 days, making human sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica war god. And he heard the god speaking back to him, saying, deny responsibility, pretend that you had nothing to do with it, and invite the Spaniards and show them some friendship. It would be easy to kill the Spaniards in Tenochtitlan by blocking their escape. In Cholula, the Spaniards found cages where sacrificial victims were being fattened up, and the Spaniards decided to free these prisoners. About this old Cholula incident, the famous Spanish priest Bartolomeo de las Casas, in his accounts, went along with some native sources, saying that the massacre was done for terror purposes, that it was completely unjustified, that the Cholulans were not planning an attack, that all of this stuff was made up, and that really the only reason why this fairly brutal violence took place was because the Spaniards wanted to scare everybody else into submission. Bernal Diaz has some harsh words for de las Casas, saying that he wasn't even there and basically doesn't know what he's talking about. And this idea that the Spaniards attacked the Cholulans for no reason is just complete crazy talk. Moctezuma, of course, as you may imagine, sent a message to Cortés saying that he had nothing to do with the plot, and this was only done by, local lords, and he would punish them. Historian Camilla Townsend believes the massacre at Cholula took place because the Tlaxcalans fed the Spaniards fake information to get rid of the current Cholulan leadership that had moved away from an alliance with them to an alliance with the Mexica. Which, sure, it's possible, but obviously can't be proven. Back to the whole idea that we discussed in the previous episode about whether the locals, whether the Mexica and other people believed that Cortés was a reincarnation of Quetzalcoatl. Well, clearly it's kind of hard to believe this. If they ever did believe it before, it's hard to continue believing it now, since Cortés had promptly sacked the temple of Quetzalcoatl in the city. It does not seem the thing that Quetzalcoatl himself would do. The Tlaxcalans say, okay, great job on this victory at Cholula, but there are good chances that if you're going into Tenochtitlan, you're going to be attacked, so we're going to send warriors to come with you to help you. The Totonacs say, look, we've been lucky so far, we've been doing a great job, but we're afraid to get killed. The Mexica mean business. They are not the Cholulans, they are not the people we've faced so far. We want to go back home. And Cortés tried real hard to convince them to go on, but realizing they wouldn't budge, he gave them a bunch of gifts and sent them home. On their slow way toward Tenochtitlan, in many towns, Cortés ran into local people complaining that the Mexica would rape their wives and daughters in front of them and would make the men work like slaves. So these were subject towns, were quite upset, they were complaining about Mexica rules. The Tlaxcalans in the meantime kept insisting, don't go to Tenochtitlan, they are going to kill you. And Cortés replied, only God has the power to kill us. We're not worrying about any human enemy. The Mexica keep doing the thing they have been doing, which hasn't been working, but somehow they think that now it will work. They keep giving the Spaniards a whole lot of gold, but they also say, please don't come to Tenochtitlan. Many of the local population may, even though we like you, we meaning Moctezuma and the nobility, some of the locals wouldn't understand and will try to fight you, and plus the road over here is bad and we don't have a lot of food. And, nothing that Cortés would listen to. Cortés replied, basically deflecting responsibility for his choice, and he said, I can't go back, or my king will be mad at me. Moctezuma, by now, is clearly getting desperate. At one point, he sent a man pretending to be him, pretending to be Moctezuma, figuring that since Cortés was insisting on meeting him, well, great, he could meet this other guy. Then the Spaniards could be happy and they would leave. This move tells you a lot about how terrible Moctezuma's decision-making was at this point. It's not really clear. Who did he think he was going to fool? I mean, the Tlaxcalan took a look at this guy who was sent as here is Moctezuma. They took a look for probably 0.5 seconds and immediately told the Spaniards that's not Moctezuma. Cortés laughed at this guy and said, come on, stop lying. I quote Cortés' words. He said, go home. Why do you lie to us? Whom do you take us to be? You cannot mock us, nor make us stupid, nor flatter us, nor become our eyes, nor trick us, nor misdirect our gaze, nor turn us back, nor destroy us, nor dazzle us, nor cast mud in our eyes. You are not he, meaning you're not Moctezuma. And then Cortés continued, now Moctezuma cannot hide from us. He cannot take refuge from us. Where, after all, can he go? Is he perhaps a bird that he can fly away? Or can he burrow under the earth? Is there somewhere a mountain pierced by a hole which he can enter? We shall see him. We shall not fail to look him in the face. We shall hear what he has to say. This speech actually reminds me a lot of the reggae song Down Pressor Man made famous by Peter Tosh. I'm not totally sure, but I think I quoted Downpressor Man already during the series about the 10,000, Xenophon's story about the Greek expedition in Persia. I think. Not sure. In any case, it seems to be fitting now. If you check out the lyrics of Downpressor Man, they seem to be almost inspired by Cortes. Well, maybe not, but close enough. In any case, upon hearing this reply, we can probably imagine that Moctezuma found himself in urgent need of adult diapers. If he wasn't already scared before, now he definitely has a reason. And in case he wasn't creeped out enough, he heard from some of his shamans who had visited the Spaniards that on the way back, walking back toward Tenochtitlan, they had run into a drunken man who was bound with ropes. Now that's already kind of a weird sight. You come upon this drunken guy bound with ropes on the road, and this man told them that Tenochtitlan would soon be no more. He told them, look toward the lake. So, by now they were coming at the edges of the lake. They were coming in the area where, from a distance they could see the lake far away. He told them to look at the lake from a distance. And when they turned, they all saw Tenochtitlan burning and fighting going on. Now, this was not something that was actually happening there, but it was like a vision, almost like a prophecy of what was to come. And to make things even creepier, when they turned back, the drunken man who was bound, who told them this story, had just vanished. He had disappeared. So the shaman told Moctezuma that they believed that the drunken man was Tezcatlipoca, one of the trickster gods of the Mexica pantheon. Most Mexica were ready to fight every inch of the way against the Spaniards, but Moctezuma was not so sure that this was the right thing to do. The story goes that Moctezuma kept crying and praying to the gods, trying to figure out what to do, and pulling the same Blues Brothers routine he has already done. In case you're wondering what I'm referring to, I believe in episode 2 I discussed the whole Blues Brother excuse that Moctezuma was giving. He kept sending gold to the Spaniards and telling Cortes, look, don't come, I'm sick, no wait, don't come, the road is too bad, my people don't like the visit, the trip is gonna be dangerous, every excuse in the book to try to convince Cortes to stay away, and all of these were empty talk, because Cortes was not going to be so easily swayed. By now Cortes and the Spaniards arrived in sight of the lake. On November 8, 1519, they made their way to the causeway connecting the mainland to Tenochtitlan, the Mexica capital that was on an island in the middle of the lake. All the soldiers were blown away by what they saw. They saw that the vision of this city on the island in the middle of this giant lake, it was one of the greatest sights that anyone could bear witness to. They said it looked like Venice if Venice was covered with pyramids. Tenochtitlan was bigger, cleaner, and more beautiful than any city in Europe. Cortes himself was really impressed with the city. He was impressed by the size, by the temples, by the number of canoes in the lake. Probably, and again estimates are very vague, but probably somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people lived there. The whole Valley of Mexico was, beside the Tenochtitlan itself in the center of the lake. There were lots of towns around the lake. So it's estimated that the whole Valley of Mexico probably was occupied by somewhere between, low estimates say 1 million people, high estimates say 2.6 million. No one knows for sure. To give you an idea for frame of reference, Paris at this time had at most 150,000 people and probably less. So this was clearly a highly complex civilization. I'm going to quote for you regarding what they saw when they were coming upon the scene. He said, and I believe this is Bernal Diaz. I didn't write it in my notes, but I'm fairly sure that's Diaz. And when we saw all those cities and villages built in the water, and other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading to Mexico, we were astounded. These great towns and quays and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It is not surprising, therefore, that I should write in this vein. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe the first glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamed of before. And yet, despite this amazing vision that Diaz is describing, giving us a hint of what's to come, Diaz continues saying, "But today, all that I then saw is overthrown and destroyed. Nothing is left standing." So that tells you a bit about what's about to happen. The Mexica were equally puzzled by the sight in front of them. The arrival of the Spanish armies with their Tlaxcalan allies. They were used enough to the Tlaxcalans, but seeing the Spaniards, their white skin, their shining armor, their horses, the dogs, all of that stuff was very puzzling. And the fact that the Tlaxcalan were allied with the Spaniards, were singing upon coming into the city. They were singing as if for war. That did not reassure the Mexica. There were barely over 400 Spaniards at this time in this mission, and a few thousand Tlaxcalan allies entering Tenochtitlan. This clearly was a pretty gutsy move. In what men in all the world have shown such daring? There's no argument that these guys were gutsy, for sure. The Tlaxcalans in particular must have been thrilled entering their enemy's cities with weapons in hand. The only time a Tlaxcalan ever made it to Tenochtitlan was tied up, with a rope around his neck and brought to be sacrificed on the Mexica pyramids. So these signaled a shift in their relation. Now, the key moment, or rather a key moment in this story arrived now. Despite how much he had tried to avoid it, now Moctezuma finally accepted to meet with Cortés. We have no idea what Moctezuma was thinking, whether he was planning to trap the Spaniards into the city, or to just wait to see how things would turn out, or what. But in either case, Moctezuma was carried upon a litter, and he approached the Spaniards on the causeways. Moctezuma at this time was about 40 years old. It's said that he was fairly tall, not particularly dark-skinned, and he arrived at this point. Promptly there was an exchange of gifts taking place. Cortés tried to hug him, to give him a big hug, which I guess in Spain wasn't such a big deal, but among the Mexica there was definitely a no-no. You don't just go out and hug the emperor. That's not the way it works. So some of Moctezuma's attendants stopped him from doing it. But they were okay with Cortés shaking hands with Moctezuma. To give you an idea, to put this in context, the Mexica had the death penalty for anyone daring to look at Moctezuma's face without authorization. So you can imagine how freaked out they were by this guy trying to hug their emperor. They tried to put their best face forward, though. They exchanged necklaces. Moctezuma was sporting some nose piercing, earplugs, a piercing with a jewel in his lip. Diaz described a little bit the scene of what he saw around. He said, "Who could count the multitude of men, women and children, which had come out on the roofs, in their boats on the canals, or in the streets to see us? It was a wonderful sight, and as I write, it all passes before my eyes, as it were yesterday." Keep in mind that Diaz wrote his whole narration of the events decades after the fact. So when he says, I can still see it, it's as if it just happened yesterday. This is not a guy who was writing 3 months later. This is happening, he's emphasizing how much this has stuck with him for his whole life. The Spaniards were invited to set up home at the palace of Moctezuma's father. Moctezuma's father had long been dead, but in any case, the palace that used to belong to him in the central part of the city. This happened on November 8, 1519. Spaniards were offered food, lodging. It's unclear what Moctezuma actually said during this exchange, but Cortés supposedly decided to interpret that Moctezuma had told him that he accepted becoming a vassal of the King of Spain. And Moctezuma and Cortés replied, "Have confidence, Moctezuma. Fear nothing. We love you greatly." This goes under the file famous last words. If Cortés, who basically lied even in his sleep, said, "Fear nothing, we love you greatly," then you really know it's time to get really scared. Moctezuma apologized for trying to discourage the Spaniards from coming to Tenochtitlan, but he told the Spaniards that his people were afraid of the stories told about the Spaniards and about their powers. After the initial pleasantries, one of the first speeches that Cortés gave to Moctezuma was about one of his pet peeves, the idea of the superiority of Christianity, of how they should all become Christians. And Moctezuma said, "Yeah, I already heard this story from my ambassadors," but I'll quote from Moctezuma's answer, "We have given you no answer, since we have worshipped our own gods here from the beginning, and know them to be good. No doubt yours are good also." Here is Moctezuma is trying to be a nice guy. "But do not trouble to tell us any more about them at present." In other words, great that you have your religion and you like it, we have ours and we like it. Can you stop bugging us about trying to change us? While these initial dialogues were taking place, the Spaniards started exploring the beauty of the city and the Mexica customs. Among the cultural practices that puzzled the Spaniards was the fact that the Mexica washed themselves multiple times a day. The Spaniards were more of the, "Hey look, spring has arrived, it's time to take a bath" school of thought. Their thinking was that paying much attention to the body was seen as opening the door to sin. So the Spaniards were really not that big on bathing. Personal hygiene was not high up on their priority list. So seeing the natives bathing multiple times a day, they thought it was really weird. Bernal Diaz was amazed that Moctezuma changed his clothes every day and didn't wear them again until several days later after probably they had been washed. For Diaz was like, what a weird custom. Can you believe these guys change their clothes and they bathe? Weird people out here. As most rulers around the world, Moctezuma enjoyed constant amusement. Some of his favorite pastimes were having humpback dwarves singing and dancing around, having court jesters, musicians. It's kind of funny how these kind of things seem to be a big hit with many kings and queens around the world, even in cultures that never met each other. Musicians, clowns, dwarves for some reason. All of this stuff is something that seems to often feature among the pastime of royalty. Moctezuma's palace was built on over 6 acres of land. The Spaniards around this time, they visit the market in Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco was a sister city of Tenochtitlan. It was basically right next door. It was kind of almost hard to tell where one city ended and the other began. In any case, the giant market in Tlatelolco was something that highly impressed the Spaniards. They said that they saw no market was ever half this big. In their whole lives, they'd never seen anything like it. They said that at the markets there were judges to make decisions about disputes between customers and sellers. If anybody was caught stealing some goods, they were executed on the spots. There was a slave market there. There were also a lot of prostitutes and gamblers frequented the area. The presence of lots of sex workers is something that the Spaniards noticed quickly in the city. In the Florentine Codex, they describe these women as painting their faces, and then, I quote, these were women who found pleasure in their bodies, shameless, eating mushrooms. Because, one of the customs that was rather common among the Mexica was the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, which was really fairly widespread in the population, but apparently many of the prostitutes were quite fond of this. There's really no report on whether the Spaniards did try these hallucinogenic mushrooms or not, so we're not entirely sure. But in Spain, the Spaniards were not... It's not that they never heard of psychedelics before. The people in Spain use belladonna, mandrake, and other mild psychedelic herbs. One of the things that the Spaniards also noticed was that many women among the Mexica either tattooed or painted their bodies for erotic purposes. Beside taking notice of the local female population, the Spaniards were of course very impressed with the pyramids. Initially they weren't really too clear on why the steps to go up and down the pyramids were so small and so steep. I remember as a kid, when I was 11 years old, when I visited Mexico and I saw some of the pyramids. Clearly not in Tenochtitlan, since Tenochtitlan is no more, but other pyramids around Mexico. But I was always puzzled that, why by the time you reach the top of a pyramid and you look down, it seemed like the steps had disappeared, like there are no more steps, because they were so narrow that when you look down, you're like, are they still even there? How do I get back down? What I didn't know was that the steepness, the pyramids were so steep, they were designed that way, so that the bodies of the sacrificial victims would fall down. They could be rolled down the steps and they would fall down at the base of the pyramid with nothing to stop them. Today, eventually, many pyramids in Mexico have been closed because way too many tourists have been falling to their deaths by tripping on one of these tiny steps and just rolling all the way down. So many of these places that I was able to climb as a kid are no longer. They are still there, you can still visit them, but you cannot climb on them no more. Moctezuma, noticing that the Spaniards were so impressed with the pyramids, he took them to the top of the Great Temple, the main temple in Tenochtitlan. So the Spaniards climbed along with Moctezuma, and from there they had a view of the whole city as well as the lake. And again from Bernal Diaz, some of our soldiers who have been in many parts of the world, in Constantinople, in Rome, and all over Italy, said that they had never seen a market so well laid out, so large, so orderly, and so full of people. This is still referring to the Tlatelolco market, that they could now get a view from the top of the Great Temple. They were also shown, the Spaniards were shown the statues of the Mexica gods, and the shrines, which were covered in blood. Diaz said that next to the shrine it stank worse than slaughterhouses in Spain. Again in his words, they kept a very large drum there, and when they beat it, the sounds was most dismal, like some music from the infernal regions, as you might say, and it could be heard for 6 miles away. So Cortés now, he pressed the issue further. He said, how can a wise lord like you, Moctezuma, worship devils? And Moctezuma had been tremendously meek until this point, but Cortés had touched a sensitive spot, so he got really mad. He said he should have never brought Cortés up there had he known that he was going to say such insulting things. Bernal Diaz report in the following way, the Moctezuma speech. He said, "If I had known that you were going to say these terrible things, I would have not shown you my gods. We hold them to be very good. They give us health and rain and good crops and weather, and all the victories we desire. So we are bound to worship them and sacrifice to them, and I beg you to say nothing more against them." The speech was forceful enough that it convinced Cortés to make a rare apology. He did ask, however, to allow the Spaniards to put up a picture of the Virgin Mary inside the temple. Moctezuma was not bothered by the idea of adding the Virgin Mary into the temple. He was bothered by the exclusive approach that the Spaniards had, which basically said our religion is the only good one, everything else needs to go away. He was still a bit bent out of shape about it, so he said he was going to stay behind. The Spaniards could go back to the palace where they were staying, but he himself would stay behind to make amends to the gods for having brought disrespectful Spaniards to the temple. By the time the Spaniards leave the great temple at Tenochtitlan, they get back to the palace where they were housed, and they find out that one of Cortés' carpenters had found signs that a door in the palace had been recently blocked. So the Spaniards got curious, why did they block it, what's behind it? So they opened it and found out that there was a lot of treasure that belonged to Moctezuma's deceased father had been hidden in there. And so they promptly decide to help themselves to it. They are, however, worried, because first they got on Moctezuma's nerves by insulting the Mexica gods. Now they are pillaging Moctezuma's father's treasure. So clearly, they know they are doing stuff that could get on the wrong side of the Mexica. And they begin to worry that if the Mexica decide to remove some of the bridges connecting the city to the mainland, the Spaniards would be cut off from the mainland and be trapped. So that's going through the back of their mind. Just as these annoying thoughts are spoiling their happy pillaging, messengers from Tlaxcala arrive with less than thrilling news. They tell Cortés that his lieutenant in Veracruz, because if you recall, the Spaniards had left some men in Veracruz along the coast at this settlement they had created. Cortés' lieutenant, Juan de Escalante, had been killed along with 6 other Spaniards and several allied Totonacs. How was he killed? What happened? What was going on? Well, here is what happened. Some Mexica had stopped by to visit the Totonacs, and they had asked for tribute. Escalante had said, no way, no, the Totonacs are under our protection, you cannot get tribute out of them. So this led to a fight, which led to the deaths. Along the way, the Mexica even captured a Spaniard during this small conflict, who was promptly sacrificed. And then they chop off his head and sent his head back to Tenochtitlan for Moctezuma to see. And Moctezuma responded the way he normally does to pretty much everything. He panicked. He had not sent the order to have a fight with the Spaniards, and now he begins to freak out at the idea that some of his subjects are forcing a confrontation with the Spaniards. This not only is bad news for Moctezuma, it's definitely bad news for the Spaniards, because now several of the Totonac towns stop supporting the Spaniards, thinking, well, if you don't have the strength to protect us, what's the point of allying ourselves with you? So now, in this very delicate situation, Cortés managed to find something good in it. He finds that he now has the perfect excuse for his next move. And his next move is a rather bold one. He plans on kidnapping Moctezuma to make sure that his Mexica subject would not attack the Spaniards. Many of Cortés' captains say, look, we better take him now rather than wait for them to attack. They had noticed that the Mexica were getting less and less polite. They were picking up on the signs that they were quickly wearing out their welcome in Tenochtitlan. So they all agreed that it was time for action. So Cortés along with 5 of his main captains, including Pedro de Alvarado, Gonzalo de Sandoval, Juan Velázquez de León, Francisco de Lugo, and Alonso de Avila. They all went to seek an audience with Moctezuma. Bernal Diaz, one of our main sources, went along with them, along with a few other soldiers and the translators, Aguilar and Malintzin. During the visit, Moctezuma handed them jewels, and even, in this effort to keep the Spaniards feeling like they had his friendship, not only he handed out lots of gold to them, but even offered one of his daughters in marriage to Cortés. Cortés was like, well, thanks for all the gold, that's sweet, I like that, but he quickly switched the discussion to confronting Moctezuma about the fight at Veracruz. He told him he had evidence that Moctezuma was responsible for the death of 6 of his soldiers. And he said he couldn't understand why Moctezuma would do this after they had become friends. He just flat out to his face accuses Moctezuma of dishonesty and of betraying his friendship. Now, nobody spoke to Moctezuma like that. Speaking to the Mexica emperor in those terms was clearly something that Moctezuma probably didn't even know how to respond to. He was so outside the pale of what normally happened in the throne room. And tension in the room increased with pretty much every word that was spoken. By now, Cortés is going full on. He says, by now I believe that you, meaning Moctezuma, were behind the Cholula attack as well. And he says, I quote from Bernal Diaz's recording of Cortés' words, I have no desire to start a war on this account, or to destroy this city. Everything will be forgiven, provided you will now come quietly with us to our quarters, and make no protest. You will be as well served and attended there as in your own palace. But if you cry out, or raise any commotion, you will immediately be killed by these captains of mine, whom I've brought for this sole purpose. Talk about a gamble. Cortés had just threatened with death the most powerful man in all of Mexico. Moctezuma responded saying he had never authorized the attack, and he would send men to capture the people who did it and punish them. The guilty would be punished. But he said he would not go with the Spaniards and become their prisoners. In, again, the words attributed to Moctezuma by Bernal Diaz, my person is not such as can be made a prisoner of. Even if I would like it, my people would not suffer it. Cortés said, well, that's too bad, but you really have to come with us until we discover the truth. So they talk back and forth, they're arguing about what to do, and some of Cortés' captains are getting tense. Juan Velázquez de León said, what is the use of all these words? Either we take him or we knife him. If we do not look after ourselves now, we shall be dead men. Diaz described Velázquez's voice as high and terrifying. Moctezuma clearly couldn't understand because Velázquez de León had just spoken in Spanish. So he asked what was all the commotion about, what was being said. And Malintzin told him that he better go along, and he'll be treated well. And I quote, but if you stay here, you will be a dead man. Moctezuma is trying in every way to avoid this. He say, look, take some of my children as hostages, and the Spaniards say, nope, not good enough. They tell him, look, you need to tell your guards that you're going of your own free will, and that, if you want to give a good excuse, tell that your god, the war god Huitzilopochtli, has commanded it. You can bring your servants, you can bring your women. In the meantime, you can even keep ruling over the Mexica. We're not going to take that away. Basically, what the Spaniards are saying is, you're going to be our puppet ruler. You live next to us, we tell you what to do, and then you got to make the big voice and act as if you are ruling over the Mexica. At this juncture, Moctezuma had a chance to die well. He could call for his guards, have all the Spaniards killed. Of course, he would be killed before they are, but he would probably have, at this point, the Spaniards are in his palace. They would be quickly surrounded and killed. So he could do it. He would have to pay with his life. But fear robbed him of his chance to go out in a blaze of glory. His fear had already caused him to make several mistakes that have made it possible for the Spaniards to now be within striking distance. And now he makes another one. Amazingly enough, he accepts to move with the Spaniards, which basically means becoming their prisoner. He's too scared to get killed before his guards could attempt to rescue him, and so he just goes along. This was a man whose orders had caused the imprisonment and the enslavement of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people. And now he gets to find out how captivity is not so fun once the roles are switched. Cortés clearly had played his hand masterfully. The friendly behavior of the previous days had lulled Moctezuma in a false sense of security, so that he had not seen that the Spaniards were getting ready to make their move. He had lowered his defenses and let them get too close. And now all of the Mexica were going to pay dearly for this mistake. Obviously, the Mexica weren't stupid. It didn't take long for many of the nobles to realize that Moctezuma was a prisoner. Yes, he was treated well. He even got into this weird relationship with the Spaniards. He liked some of the guards who were watching over him day and night. These guys would crack jokes with him and make him laugh. But no matter how gilded the cage, it was still a cage. In the following days, things got even weirder, because the men who had killed Escalante and the other few Spaniards were now brought as prisoners in front of Cortés, and they said they didn't do it under Moctezuma's orders. They had acted independently. Later, however, probably after enough torture, they said that Moctezuma had ordered it. So, obviously we don't know. We have no idea if they changed their story just because if you torture people long enough, they'll tell you anything you want, or because Moctezuma had actually ordered it. It's hard to tell. But now Cortés faced Moctezuma and said he believed he had ordered it, but he liked him so much that he wouldn't let anyone hurt him. Again, that's the classic Cortés game of playing good cop, bad cop, in a way that really seemed to work on Moctezuma. First scare him, show him the possibility of something horrible happening to him, and then show him some love. Say, oh, but I like you so much that don't worry, I'll take care of you. Cortés, however, did not like so much the men who had killed Escalante, so he sentenced those men, 17 of them, to be burned to death in the square in front of the Great Pyramid. To add insult to injury, Moctezuma was brought along and forced to watch the execution of 17 of his men. These guys were tied up, set on fire, while still alive. Their screaming was the only sound throughout the plaza. Many Mexica gathered together to see what was happening, and they see some of their own people getting burned to death in front of their emperor, without their emperor intervening or doing anything. So the Mexicas saw this burning in stunned silence. How could Moctezuma have allowed it? Theirs was the most powerful empire in the country, and yet, due to their emperor's lack of resolve, here there were strangers who had made themselves at home and were even burning to death Mexica soldiers on the public square. You have to wonder about what was going on through the heads of most Mexica at this point. Cortés told Moctezuma he could go free now if he wanted. Moctezuma said thank you, but he knew that Cortés' offer was a bluff, since the captains wouldn't let him. Aguilar, one of the Spanish translator, he had told Moctezuma ahead of time that don't even think about taking Cortés' offer. So, Moctezuma understood that this was just an empty gesture and didn't take him up on it. For the following few months, Moctezuma seemed to still be ruling. He still had sex with his women, he still received visits, even went out of the city with the Spaniards to hunt. He would walk out, of course, under Spanish guards and watch ball games and visit his zoo. Cortés and Moctezuma even developed this really weird relationship where they would play games together and gamble together. In one occasion, Cortés had a soldier who had been disrespectful to Moctezuma flogged. Moctezuma regularly gave gifts to his guards. Our main source, Bernal Diaz, at one point asked Moctezuma if he could do him a favor. Specifically, the favor being, he was asking for a gift, what he desired most. And as it turns out, what he desired most was a pretty Mexica woman. And Moctezuma gave him one who was later called Doña Francisca. Similarly, while taking breaks from plotting and conquering empires, Cortés had sex with a daughter as well as a niece of Moctezuma. No comment there, interesting enough. Moctezuma at one point asked permission to pray at the Great Temple, and Cortés said, okay, sure, you can go under guard, under guards who clearly will try to kill you if you try to flee, but yes, you can go and pray, just don't perform human sacrifices. Moctezuma, in one of his rare defiant moments, sacrificed some people anyway, and afterwards was brought back to his quarters. The Spanish guards decided to ignore the human sacrifices to avoid trouble for the time being. Moctezuma said he loved Cortés as a brother. Now, all of these weird dynamics between Cortés and Moctezuma, either Moctezuma's words were an act because he had to, or possibly the Stockholm Syndrome should be named the Tenochtitlan Syndrome, because Moctezuma seemed to be fitting that to a T. I mean, it's like he's developing this really bizarre, strange relationship with the Spaniards. Along the way, he told Cortés that the Mexica had to be ruled through fear. That was the proper way to handle the empire. Clearly fear was obviously working on him, so I don't know if it was true for the rest of the Mexica. It was definitely true as far as dealing with Moctezuma, but we'll see more about that. Cortés, in the meantime, was quite unhappy with the news that the successor of Escalante was being bossy with those Totonacs who had still remained under Spanish influence. So he had brought him to Tenochtitlan and put him in chains. Cortés also organized his men to start building 4 large boats, since he figured that the lake would be their only escape route if the Mexica decided to block the bridges. So he spent much time sailing in this boat to learn as much as he could about the lake. One of the first hints that the Mexica had had enough started during a visit to Texcoco, one of the other main cities along the lake. They were part of the Mexica Triple Alliance, along with Tenochtitlan and Tacuba. Cortés had the younger brothers of King Cacamatzin, who was the grandson of the legendary Netzahualcoyotl, who was the main subject, the main character of the bonus episode, the prequel to this whole series. So here we are dealing with a couple of generations later. Cortés had the younger brothers of the king show him around. In that moment, a messenger from Moctezuma arrived and took these brothers aside. Supposedly, what they will say later is that the messenger had arrived to tell them to give as much gold to the Spaniards as they wanted, but Cortés thought that these whispering in each other's ear was really a sign of a trap, so he ordered the brothers executed. Moctezuma intervened, saying, No, don't do it, please, and Cortés said, okay, fine, I won't kill them then. However, Cacamatzin, the king of Texcoco, didn't really appreciate this, and started planning a rebellion. Moctezuma found out, and immediately went to tell Cortés about this planned rebellion. Probably what was going on is Moctezuma was scared that Cortés would find out on his own, and then would take vengeance on him. So Moctezuma sent a message to Kakamatzin saying, look, I am friends with the Spaniards now, so do not attack them. But obviously the deference for the emperor was beginning to fade away, because Kakamatzin replied that Moctezuma should be ashamed of having been played by the Spaniards. He said, the Spaniard took my uncle's heart and his strength. Kakamatzin also had a brother named I'm gonna take a wild guess here because sometimes Mexica names are troubling, so let me try to play with it. Ready, Daniele? You can do it. Come on. Ixtlilxochitl. Come on, that was easy. Piece of cake. Ixtlilxochitl. Maybe. I don't know if I pronounced it right. In any case, he said he agreed with his brother, even though they had been fighting and they were kind of competing for the kingdom in Texcoco. Ixtlilxochitl said he agreed with his brother Kakamatzin and that they should join forces. But as it turns out, Ixtlilxochitl had other plans. Rather than join forces with his brother against the Spaniard, he decided to fake an alliance only to be able to capture his brother and deliver him to Cortés as a prisoner. So the internal rivalries in the politics of Texcoco convinced him that casting his lot with the Spaniards was the best option. Other lords allied with Kakamatzin were captured as well. Ixtlilxochitl's decision to side with the Spaniards was a really key moment in the political game that was being played here. Cortés picked another one of the brothers, as naming him as future king of Texcoco. In the meantime, Kakamatzin tried to bribe Cortés by giving him gold. Cortés' men believed that there was a lot more of gold, that this was just a taste. So Alvarado brought Kakamatzin back to Texcoco to find it. Hours went by, they didn't return. So Cortés sent some other people to see what was going on, what's taking so long. Weren't they just looking for some gold and coming back? He found out that Alvarado had got annoyed at not finding gold. So he had tied Kakamatzin to a stake and was trying to encourage him to talk by having him burned with brands from a fire. Not killing him, just, barbecuing him a little. By January, Cortés forced Moctezuma to ask his lords to swear loyalty to the Spaniards and to hand over some of their kids as hostages. So Cortés is taking just 1 inch at a time, but is slowly asking for more and more and more. Moctezuma gave his usual wimpy speech, saying that none of this would have happened if it wasn't the will of Huitzilopochtli. However, as he's saying this and he's inviting the lords to do as Cortés is saying, and he's saying, yeah, this is the will of the gods, he broke down and cried as he was speaking. Moctezuma was clearly much better at dishing out pain to others than handling it. After this oath of allegiance was sworn by some of the lords, Cortés could now claim that any hostility to him would be considered a rebellion, and so he would be justified in punishing the Mexica. Moctezuma handed one more daughter to Cortés as a concubine, again trying to placate him. And Cortés convinced also Moctezuma to grant permission to build an altar to the Virgin Mary in the Great Temple. So they went out to the Great Temple, Cortés and some of his men. The priests were horrified at the request. They said that if the Spaniards did anything there, the whole empire would rise against them. And Cortés responded in less than diplomatic fashion by smashing some of the statues of the Mexica god. The Mexica got, as you may imagine, fairly horrified, so they quickly set up, they organized this movement of many men trying to remove the statues from the temple, being very careful about not breaking them and relocating them. They never told the Spaniards where the statues were placed. In the meantime, the Spaniards, fairly pleased with themselves, they placed a Christian altar in the temple. Cortés ordered that no more sacrifice should be performed, which, probably they were still done in hiding somewhere, but not officially at least. Moctezuma told Cortés, I'm sorry to inform you, but my gods have ordered me to make war on the Spaniards. However, I don't want to, I really don't want to fight you guys. So he basically said, look, I'm gonna let you guys take anything you want and live in peace. It's funny how Moctezuma was clearly learning from Cortés, because both Cortés and Moctezuma were using the same technique of pretending to be nice, but arguing that other forces were bad cops pushing for certain action. In this case, Moctezuma is saying, look, it's my gods who are ordering me to start a war against you. I don't want to do it. You guys are nice. I like you. You're my friends. Just grab some gold and go home. Cortés had played this game long enough to not to fall for it. However, some Mexica were beginning to organize resistance. Cortés, well, he didn't fall for it, but he did play the game. He said, okay, we're gonna leave, but we have no ships on the coast, so Moctezuma, just be a darling and control your followers for a while. Just give us some time and then we'll be going soon enough. Obviously, despite all the polite words being tossed back and forth, tension is rising. Most of the Spaniards by now started sleeping in full armor with horses ready to go in case a battle started. In the words of Bernal Diaz, I grew so accustomed to going about armed and sleeping in the way I have described, that after the conquest of New Spain I kept the habit of sleeping in my clothes and without a bed. I slept better that way than on a mattress. What is more, I can only sleep for a short time at night. I have to get up and look at the sky and stars and walk about for a bit in the dew. That's probably a clear sign of PTSD on Bernal Diaz's part. Back in Spain in the meantime, what was going on? Because I remember all of this stuff, all of this expedition, none of this was authorized by the king. This is all in a curious legal limbo it's happening. So back in Spain, some people wanted to have Cortés and this man hanged as rebels. Others, however, were impressed with the gold that they were sending back. So the king of Spain okayed the meeting with the men sent by Cortés. And he asked to treat well the natives that they had brought with them. Despite this, several of the natives they brought with them died of European diseases, as you may imagine. And Cortés had picked these men well, the ones who were to go to Spain and convince the king that he should legitimize their mission, because these guys started handing out gold to many key figures around the king to try to get them on their side. When the governor of Cuba found out that Cortés was sending much gold back to the king, he decided to find other ways to stop them. Legally speaking, Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, probably had the law on his side. But while having the law on your side is a nice thing, Cortés had gold on his side, and that's an even better thing. And it was clearly gaining him lots of friends back in Spain. To make the whole thing more exciting, in case, this political corruption back home, this prospect of this showdown with the Mexica in Tenochtitlan, one more thing happened to add to the complexity of the situation. In April 1520, news arrived from Veracruz that 18 Spanish warships had just arrived on the coast. Cortés understood at once that the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, had sent someone to look for him to settle the score, and the visit was not going to be friendly. The someone specifically was a man named Pánfilo de Narváez, who had just arrived in Mexico with some 900 armed men to go after Cortés. What neither Narváez nor Cortés knew at this time was that the ships were carrying with them the very key that would help the Spaniards in the conquest of Mexico. Because realistically, no matter how well Cortés had orchestrated things so far, once the Mexica would find a way to get rid of Moctezuma and his weak leadership, they were very likely to be able to crush Cortés and his men. However, now Cortés' enemy, Narvaez, was going to unwittingly hand him over the Trojan horse that Cortés badly needed. What happened was that the smallpox epidemic had broken out in Spain in 1519 and had been brought to Cuba. And one of the men on the ships had caught it. The true conquerors of Mexico had just arrived, and they were the germs that this man was carrying. But no one knew this at this time. Oblivious to the importance of this sick man on the ship, the two Spanish commanders were busy plotting the best way to murder each other. Narvaez had arrived on the coast and started visiting the Totonacs, telling them that Cortés was a bad man. The Totonacs wisely treated him well, because essentially they were waiting to see which Spaniards would win. And, their alliance with Cortés was one of convenience. It's not that they had any great love for him. They just wanted to be on the good side of the top dog among the Spaniards. Whether this would be Cortés or somebody else didn't really matter much to them. Moctezuma received news from his spies of Narvaez's landing, and he didn't tell Cortés about it. According to at least some sources, Narvaez had sent a message to Moctezuma saying that he would free him and then leave the land. And Moctezuma had replied, "Great, we'll help you kill Cortés, so much for being his brother and vassal, and we'll send presents." Later, afraid of being busted, Moctezuma eventually told Cortés what was going on, that Narvaez had arrived. And he told him, "Look, you can flee now. Now there are Spanish ships, so you don't need to wait no more." Cortés sent a letter to Velázquez saying, "Please don't stop me from converting Indians here." He made his semi-pirate enterprise sound like some holy mission. It was a lame attempt, and even Cortés must have known that he was never going to work with Narvaez or Velázquez. However, a few of Narvaez's men in the meantime had visited Veracruz, and they started, trying to get Cortés' guys to give up their loyalty. Sandoval, who was Cortés' man in Veracruz, ordered them arrested and sent to Tenochtitlan in chains. When they arrived to Tenochtitlan, in classic Cortés fashion, he freed them and welcomed them, criticizing Sandoval for having been so rough with them. Again, the classic good cop, bad cop routine. Cortés gave them gold. Why would he do that? Well, to buy them, right? He wanted to get them on his side. And something magical happened here. Suddenly, with each gram of gold piling up in their pockets, their loyalty to Narvaez evaporated in proportional fashion. By the time Cortés was done dropping all this gold in their lap, they didn't even know who Narvaez was anymore. And they suggested sending gold to other people in Narvaez's army in order to bring them to Cortés' side. Cortés liked the idea, so he sent these guys back to Narvaez to tell other people about the wealth they had seen in Tenochtitlan. So when these guys rejoined Narvaez's forces, they began whispering in everyone's ears that Cortés could cover in gold anyone supporting him. But I quote, here is a quote from Bernal Diaz. "But if they had known the Mexican strength, no one of them would have volunteered." What's going on with the Totonacs? The Totonacs, as I mentioned, they were sitting on the sideline waiting to see who would win. Our old friend, the Fat Chief, had chosen to welcome Narvaez initially to avoid trouble, but he quickly was turned off by the fact that some of Narvaez's men were capturing Totonac women and handing them out to the men to be raped, clearly. Cortés at least had the decency to be given sex slaves as present, Narvaez instead went on raping expeditions without asking permission, so he ended up on the fat chief's bedside. Moctezuma supposedly offered Cortés some 100,000 Mexica warriors to help go crush the Spaniards who were coming for him. The plan was probably to betray Cortés and kill him and his guys by joining the other Spaniards, or perhaps wait for them to kill each other and then wipe out the survivors. But Malintzin told Cortés that she knew Moctezuma was lying, and not to listen to him. So Cortés bid goodbye to Moctezuma. Moctezuma seems sad at seeing Cortés leave to face the Spaniards on the coast. Malintzin, again reading Moctezuma like an open book, says he's faking it. He's just putting on a show. In any case, Cortés took 80 men with him and left about 120 with Alvarado in Tenochtitlan. Many other Spaniards were in various missions, some in Veracruz, some in missions to explore the interior of the country. He managed to then gather some of the men from this expedition in the interior until he had roughly about 260 men with him. Malintzin was along with the 260 men by Cortés' side. From a purely numerical point of view, the odds look grim for Cortés. His 260 Spaniards against some 900 Spaniards obviously was not a good match. But Cortés was a brilliant politician, using gentleness and bribes to change numerical odds that did not look good. While waiting for Cortés to show up, Narvaez was feeling pretty confident about his superior numbers, set himself up. They decided to camp at the top of a Totonac temple. That's where they set up base. On the night between May 28 and May 29th, 1520, is when Cortés will get to find out whether he can pull off the upset or not. It was raining heavily, so Cortés and his men decided to attack at night using darkness and rain as cover. They managed to capture a couple of Narvaez sentries. One of them they captured, one of them escaped. And the one who escaped ran like crazy, got to the top of the temple and warned Narvaez so that he and his men just woke up all of a sudden and started preparing for battle. They had not expected Cortés to get there so quickly. But speaking of not expecting for them to get there so quickly, Sandoval and the men under him were immediately there right after the sentry, and Cortés showed up shortly thereafter. So here you have many of Narvaez's men still half asleep, finding Sandoval and his men. During the fighting, one of Sandoval's pikemen managed to stick his pike in Narvaez's eye, taking it out. Some of the other men that Sandoval had with him set fire to the roof of the shrine. So not only is Narvaez one eye short, but he's also got his feet burned in this fire. And these men were not really feeling the fight very much, so they quickly surrendered. Cortés, who had arrived on the scene in the meantime, allowed this surgeon to treat Narvaez and try to make sure he wouldn't die. Cortés' men took away from Narvaez the instructions sent by the governor of Cuba, Velázquez, and tossed them aside so that Cortés could claim not to have read the orders of his superior and basically not knowing what that they were telling him to return. Most of the men under Narvaez were defeated there. A few of them barricaded themselves in a chapel which contained a picture of the Virgin Mary. Cortés attacked this position with his own... Actually, after having stolen Narvaez's artillery, he used the cannons against this position, and this will upset quite a few ultra-religious Spaniards. But being a little blasphemous paid off, since the remainder of Narvaez's men gave up. All in all, only 15 of them had been killed, against a couple under Cortés, so it really hadn't been much of a battle in terms of numbers of people killed, of casualties, but it had been a very important confrontation in terms of making sure that Cortés now not only he defeated this threat, but now he potentially had a lot of manpower under him. Cortes turned to his prisoners and said that he would free them all if they agreed to join him. Some of Cortes' men were actually mad at how nice he was to the defeated Spaniards. But obviously there was a method to his madness. He wasn't interested in revenge, but he was very interested in recruiting more soldiers for a possible confrontation with the Mexica. Cortes sent ahead about 45 of them to Tenochtitlan under guard. However, these guys, as they made their way to the Tenochtitlan, they were killed by some of the Mexica. A clear sign that at least some of the Mexica were chomping at the bit and were itching to fight the Spaniards despite Moctezuma's meek disposition. If things had gone very smoothly for Cortes, the same cannot be said for what had been going on back in Tenochtitlan. When Cortes was still in Tenochtitlan, before heading for the coast to fight the other Spaniards, he had given permission to the Mexica to celebrate the Toxcatl religious festival. This was a ritual that, when you read the symbology of it all, is actually kind of cool. It's a whole ritual representing the fragility of love, the impermanence of life. There's some interesting symbolic meaning, but of course, being a Mexica ritual, of course it ends with some bloody sacrifice and hearts being ripped out of chests and all of the good stuff. In any case, what happens is that this is a big deal. This is a very important religious ritual in the life of the Mexica. And if we had never-ending time for this stuff, it would be interesting to get into some of the religious stuff, but there's so much narrative as is that I'll leave this to the side for the time being. This is happening in May 1520. That's the time frame when this religious ritual is supposed to take place. A few days ahead, the Tlaxcalans are beginning to stir Alvarado's paranoia by saying that the Mexica may try to rebel during the festival. Then again, Alvarado was fairly violent and equally paranoid by nature. Maybe he did have some reasons to be on edge. Maybe this was not just the Tlaxcalans spreading rumors. The Mexica had not been the friendliest as of late. They had stopped bringing food. A Mexica girl who said that food should be given to the Spaniards was found hanged. They had seen a bunch of stakes planted in the ground at the location where the festival was to take place, and the Tlaxcalans had told Alvarado that the stakes were there to tie the Spaniards and sacrifice them after they would capture them. Alvarado had also heard rumors that the Mexica were planning to hold sacrifices beside the one that had been allowed, and they wanted to bring back the statues of the gods, despite the fact that Alvarado had told them, no, you can't do that. So at one point Alvarado had rescued 3 men who looked like they were going to be sacrificial victims. He took them aside, brought them in the Spanish quarters, and asked them, what do you guys know? Are they planning sacrifices? Are they planning a rebellion? What's going on? But either these 3 guys didn't know anything, or they didn't want to speak. So either way, Alvarado switched his role from the rescuer of these guys to becoming the torturer of these guys. So he promptly tortured them by placing burning logs on top of their stomachs. They still said nothing, so to improve their morale, Alvarado had one of them thrown from the palace roof while the other 2 watched. Which is kind of weird how first he's disgusted with human sacrifice, only to torture and kill one of the guys he had quote-unquote rescued, on suspicion that he may know something. So that's a little odd, but in any case, one of the other 2 surviving members of this party decided that he didn't really want to get thrown from the roof, so he offered instead some info that he heard that there was an insurrection, a rebellion that would take place immediately after the festival. This is possibly true, or possibly the guy just made up what he figured Alvarado wanted to hear in order to avoid getting murdered by this irritable Spaniard. In either case, Alvarado decided that this information was worth looking further into it, And in Alvarado's vocabulary, looking for Terintu meant torturing somebody. So he had two of Moctezuma's relatives tortured, and they also said, whether because it was true or whether because they gave Alvarado what he wanted to hear, they said that an uprising was being planned. Alvarado told Moctezuma to do something about it, but Moctezuma replied, what do you want me to do about it? I'm here a prisoner, I can't do anything, Plus, there really was no solid evidence that this rebellion was being planned. It's highly likely that no rebellion was planned, and that the Tlaxcalans just freaked out Alvarado into striking first. The Tlaxcalans were often sacrificed after this festival. Many of their relatives have probably been killed after such a festival. So it's not that crazy to think that they were a bit on edge and that they would be more than willing to start spreading unfounded rumors of revolt, feeding Alvarado's paranoia for revenge. According to Mexica sources, which of course, who knows whether they tell the truth or not, but they say that they weren't planning any rebellion, and that what's about to happen happened because of greed. That Alvarado had seen the gold jewelry worn by the dancers at the festival, and that had inflamed his desire to just get rid of them to steal their gold. This is also unlikely. If the rebellion story is probably not true, this, what the Mexica say, is probably also not true. Because, he had plenty of jewelry already. There were many easier ways to get gold than just stage a mass attack in the middle of the ceremony. So, bottom line, who knows? We are never really gonna know what was happening with... What we do know is that in any case, the ritual began, the dance began, and Spaniards and Tlaxcalans blocked all the entrances to the plaza. And at one point, Alvarado gave the order, which doesn't exactly leave much to the imagination, because his order was, let them die, and this man promptly attacked the dancers. According to some of the Mexica sources written shortly after the conquest, I'm gonna quote from their account. They ran in among the dancers, forcing their way to the place where the drums were played. They attacked the man who was drumming and cut off his arms. Then they cut off his head, and he rolled across the floor. Then all the other Spaniards began to cut off heads, arms, and legs, and to disembowel the Indians. Some had their heads cut off, others were cut in half, and others had their bellies slit open, immediately to fall dead. Some attempted to run away, but their intestines dragged as they ran. Talk about an image that's gonna give you nightmares, right? You have these guys trying to escape this carnage, but they trip on their own intestines falling out of their bellies. Just give me just 1 second that I'm gonna go throw up in a corner and I'll be right back. In any case, back to the quote. They seemed to tangle their feet into their own entrails. No matter how they tried to save themselves, they could find no escape. Those who reached the exits were slain by the Spaniards guarding them, and others jumped over the walls of the courtyard, while yet others climbed up the temple, and still others, seeing no escape, threw themselves down among the dead, and escaped by faking death. So great was the bloodshed, that blood ran through the courtyard like water in a heavy rain. The pools of blood widened, and the stench of blood and entrails filled the air. The Spaniards ran into the communal houses to kill those who were hiding. They ran everywhere and searched everywhere. They invaded every room, hunting and killing. So, yes, that quote tells you pretty clearly what was going on, at least in terms of the action. It's estimated that the Spaniards in this surprise attack against this group of Mexica were involved in this ritual, and as such they were not armed, they did not have their weapons ready, so they made easy targets. They killed possibly about 2,000 to 3,000 people, most of them being the best warriors that the Mexica had. But of course, being the best warriors if you have no weapons doesn't help you a whole lot in this kind of engagement. So far, the Mexica had suffered without retaliation multiple offenses. They had suffered essentially what amounted to a Spanish invasion, the kidnapping of their emperor, stealing of their gold, and the destruction of their gods. And still they had managed to, because Moctezuma had said we need to keep the peace, they still kept the peace despite all that. Alvarado's massacre, however, manages to push them over the edge. Now retaliation is going to show up with a vengeance. Up at the top of the Great Pyramids, some Mexica climbed up there and started pounding on the drums, rallying the rest of the city. As the Spaniards realize, okay, we just killed 3,000 of them, it's probably to be expected that they are not going to be in a very good mood. So they retreat inside the palace. The Mexica start pouring in from the various sides of town into the plaza. And, the Spaniards are edgy. So they, just because they decided they don't really need them anymore, the situation is getting past the diplomatic standpoint. They will keep Moctezuma, but they kill Cacamatzin, the king of Texcoco, was prisoner. They kill several of the other hostages. Alvarado had been wounded during the battle, and when he got back into the palace, he went to yell at Moctezuma. And he said, "See what your people have done to me?" Moctezuma quite reasonably replied, "Alvarado, if you had not begun it, my men would not have done this. You have ruined yourselves, and me also." The Mexica burned the ships, those boats that the Spaniards had put together to sail along the lake. They burned them down, thereby eliminating any option to flee using the lake. They also at this point tried to storm the palace. There was a ton of fighting by the doors, but not... Well, I'll let some of the post-conquest account by the Mexica tell you a little bit about what happens. Here is the quote. "A few people attempted to communicate with the Spaniards. They hoped to win their favor by giving them advice and information or by secretly bringing them food. But the guards found them and killed them on the spot. They broke their necks or stoned them to death." So what's happening is that after an aborted attempt to storm the palace, which the Spaniards are able to hold on to and keep the Mexica out, many Mexica warriors, enraged by the death of 2,000 or 3,000 of their own, they start going all over the city looking for spies, looking for essentially Spanish sympathizers. And in the process, not only they killed those who were actually had been a little too friendly with the Spaniards, they even end up killing a bunch of their own people in multiple occasions. But for the next few days, the Spaniards remain barricaded inside. Occasionally fighting breaks out as the Mexica try to storm the palace. And if that's how they spend their days, the nights are not exactly any easier, because beside the difficulty of finding good sleep when you are in the midst of a city full of people who want you dead, the Spaniards are also a bit disturbed by the constant howling of the women in mourning because of all the people who have been killed in the plaza. It's in this context that on June 24th, 1520, Cortés returned with 1,300 soldiers. He left with only some, but he comes back with so many more because he was able to recruit those who have been sent against him. So he has a lot more men than he ever has. He comes back with 1,300 soldiers, including 100 horses, many experts in the use of muskets, crossbow, and also some 2,000 Tlaxcalans arriving to lend support. They arrive in Tenochtitlan, and the lively city that Cortés had left behind is just a memory now, because what he finds instead is a ghost town. There's just complete silence upon his arrival. The Mexica had all hid away. They were all in their houses. There was no one in the streets, no one to greet them. The Mexica let Cortés and the Spaniards come into the city as a trap, because they wanted to be able to catch all of the Spaniards within the city to be able to wipe them out. Cortés was furious that his plan to win the empire without fighting too hard was now going up in flames. And the whole idea, he had wanted to keep Tenochtitlan in one piece. He had wanted to win as much as he could without having to fight, but Alvarado clearly had messed it all up. He also was mad that he had lost face with Narvaez men. He had promised the royal reception, and he had promised them, this is gonna be great for us, we have the Mexica under our thumb, there's all this gold available, and instead what they find is this gigantic town getting ready for war. So the new arrivals are quite a bit bummed out. They expected gold everywhere and everything easy, and instead here they have a whole empire bent on revenge. Moctezuma, when he hears that Cortés is back, he wants to see him. But Cortés refused to speak with him, since he said that he was mad at the fact that Moctezuma had betrayed him. Cortés replied, supposedly, when Moctezuma asked for a visit, he said, "Visit him? Why? The dog doesn't even keep a market open for us, or see that they send us food to eat." Captain Velázquez, Cristobal de Olid, Francisco Lugo, and a few others, they told him, "Calm yourself, sir. Do not be so angry. Remember how well and honorably the king of this country has treated us. He's a good man. If it had not been for him, we should all of us be dead by now, and they would have eaten us. Remember, he has even given us his daughters." Cortés wouldn't have it. Supposedly, according to Bernal Diaz, he replied, "Why should I be civil to a dog who was holding secret negotiations with Narvaez, and now, as you can see, doesn't even give us food?" I think there's a good chance that Cortés was kind of overestimating Moctezuma's power over his people. I think by now Moctezuma's power was done. He could have said all he wanted about sending food, and I don't think it would have happened, but I don't think Cortés has caught on with that yet. He did decide to, and by he I mean Cortés, he did decide to free Moctezuma's brother, Cuitlahuac, hoping that he would then go back among the Mexica, calm them down, and convince them to reopen the market so that the Spaniards could be well fed. But this is a decision that Cortés would really grow to regret in the coming days and weeks. Cuitlahuac, unlike his brother Moctezuma, actually had a spine, so instead of doing Cortés' bidding, he began, as soon as he was free, he began organizing resistance. Cortés tried to send a messenger to Veracruz to get some reinforcement from there, but within minutes of leaving the palace, the messenger is right back saying he had been attacked in the streets and it was just impossible to get through. The whole town was preparing for war. The whole town was no longer silent and no longer empty. From the watchtowers in the palace, the Spaniards could see thousands of Mexica warriors in battle gear converging toward them. By the time they reached the palace in which the Spaniards were barricaded, the Mexica began throwing so many rocks with their slings that in Bernal Diaz's description he said that it looked like the whole sky was raining rocks. Cortés sent Diego de Ordaz with some 400 soldiers to try to break through the Mexica lines, but Ordaz was also attacked in the streets and from the roofs. Many Mexica would just go to the roofs of the various buildings and throw rocks from there. So 9 soldiers were quickly killed, and most of Ordaz's men were wounded. So some of the Spaniards used cannons and crossbows and muskets to try to help Ordaz rejoin them in the palace. But a full battle is raging by now. The Mexica set fire to the palace, but the Spaniards managed to turn the fire off. During the fighting, 12 more soldiers are killed, and the fighting gets so in-your-face, hand-to-hand kind of business. This is not just them sniping at each other from afar. That Cortés has his own hand wounded, like somebody with a war club just club his hand and hurt him. This gives you an idea of how up close and personal the fight became. Despite all this, the Spaniards did manage to keep the Mexica out. That night, the Mexica kept the Spaniards awake by screaming threats at them around the clock. And I can only imagine that Cortés by now missed the silence of a few days earlier. In the words of Bernal Diaz, "Though we killed and wounded many of them, they pushed forward over the points of our sword and lances, and closing their ranks, continued to fight as bravely as before. We could not drive them off." And the next day, there they start again. Again Bernal Diaz. "We were struck by the tenacity of their fighting, which was beyond description. Neither cannons, muskets, nor crossbows were of any avail, nor hand-to-hand combat, nor the slaughter of 30 or 40 of them every time we charged. They still fought on bravely, and with more vigor than before." And in another passage yet by Bernal Diaz, he says, "3 or 4 soldiers of our company who had served in Italy swore to God many times that they had never seen such fierce fighting, not even in Christian wars, or against the French king's artillery, or the Great Turk. Nor had they ever seen men so courageous as those Indians at charging with close ranks." So, the Spaniards, despite the fact that they are successful because they are able to hold the palace, they keep losing men. Every day a few more get killed in this hand-to-hand fighting. During the day, the Spaniards would charge out to try to retake some of the houses, but at night the Mexica would take them back, and then they would use the roofs of the houses close to the palace to throw a bunch of stones in the courtyard of the palace from the nearby buildings. So the Spaniards were forced to just walk at the very edges of the courtyard. There's another problem when you're under siege. You start running out of supplies. And you can last without food a lot longer than you can last without water. And the problem for the Spaniards is that the only water they had access to was from a poor well they had dug up, barely enough for so many of them. Cannons were used to shoot from the palace on the assembled Mexica, but while they did kill some, there were just too many Mexica to really make a difference. The Mexica also played some psychological warfare. Every night when the Spaniards would look out the window to check out what was going on, they would see severed heads jumping up and down as if they were alive. Who knows how the Mexica pulled that off, but in any case, they were clearly creeping out the Spaniards in a big way. On June 26th, Cortés ordered his men to build what I can only describe as a wooden tank, like this tank-like structure made of wood designed to shelter 25 men. The idea is that there will be a few holes in this wooden structure so that they could shoot through it without being killed by Mexica warriors. The Mexica yelled at them, and again, according to Bernal Diaz, they said, "Not one of us," they shouted, "would remain alive that day. They would sacrifice our hearts and blood to their gods, and with our legs and arms they would have enough to glut themselves at their feasts. They would throw our bodies for the tigers, lions, vipers, and serpents to gorge on." Again, one of the things that if you're a Spaniard in the palace doesn't contribute to your good morale. Keep hearing this stuff. At one point during these days of fighting, the Spaniards decided to charge out of the palace and make a run for the Great Temple. And the other thing they did is, rather than just taking over some houses that they would lose at night, they started destroying the houses next to the palace so that the Mexica could not then use them to throw rocks into the palace from there. The tank that I describe, and again I use the word in quotation marks, was used to try to reach the pyramid. It kind of worked for a while, but there were so many rocks thrown against this wooden structure that the Mexica destroyed it. The Spaniards managed to arrive to the temple, but by that point the whole tank was destroyed. they got into this brutal fighting on the steps of the pyramid against the Mexicas. Possibly up to 20 Spaniards died here. Diaz tells us that far from leading from the back, Cortés was a big believer in leading from the front. So here's what Diaz has to say about Cortés. He says, "Here Cortés showed himself the brave man he was. The battle was fierce and the fighting intense. What a fight it was! It was a memorable sight to see us all streaming with blood and covered with wounds, and some of us were slain. When they get to the temple, they start setting much of it on fire. They grab the priests who are living at the top of the temple and they throw them from the steps. Narvaez's men were furious with Cortés because the situation in Tenochtitlan was not really what they had signed up for, but Cortés really had no time to pay attention to them since the fighting was just non-stop. There was hardly any break. Cortés now turned to Moctezuma, say, address your people, you're still the emperor, go on the roof, tell them to stop the attacks, that we will leave the city, but they need to let us go. And Moctezuma by now is just depressed. He didn't know what to make of any of this. According to Bernal Diaz, he said, "What more does he want from me? Fate has brought me to such a pass because of him that I do not wish to leave or hear his voice again." The other captains tried to convince him, said, "Come on, please do it." And Moctezuma now took a very realistic assessment of the situation. He said, "I do not believe that I can do anything towards ending this war, because they have already chosen another lord and made up their minds not to let you leave this place alive. I believe, therefore, that all of you will be killed." Eventually they prod him enough that he decided to go up the roof and speak to the Mexica. For a moment there, seeing their emperor addressing them does freeze the Mexica in their tracks. All of them just stop fighting and begin to listen to him. And he starts his regular speech, I'm living here of my own will, I'm not a prisoner, there's no reason for war, the Spaniards are gonna leave soon. But, the Mexica are long past the point where they want to listen to this stuff. One of them yelled out that Moctezuma was a whore of the Spaniards. This somewhat aggressive Mexica, according to Bernal Diaz, he said, "Does he think that he can call to us with his woman-like soul to fight for the empire which he has abandoned out of fright?" Other Mexica were a little less angry. They kind of told him, "Look, we're sorry for what happened to you, but I've already chosen your brother, Cuitlahuac, to take over. So, and plus we promised to the gods that we're going to keep fighting until we're dead." So, basically Moctezuma's goodwill with his people has long passed its expiration date. And so after giving him a chance to make his speech and listen to him, a group of Mexica begin throwing rocks. The man who up until weeks earlier could sentence anyone to death in the empire with a simple gesture of his hand, was now getting pelted with rocks by his subjects. They hit him on the head, arms and legs, and as Diaz put it, it seemed as if the sky was raining stones, arrows, darts and sticks. So Moctezuma was wounded, the Spaniards just drag him back inside to safety. But remember how not so long ago Moctezuma had said that he wished he was dead rather than having to listen to Cortés much longer? Moctezuma has his wish fulfilled now, because by June 30, Moctezuma died. The Spaniards said that he died of his wounds. The rocks that they threw at him had damaged him enough that they managed to keep him alive a little longer, but then he died of his wounds. Mexica sources instead said that the Spaniards killed him because they realized he was no longer useful, so what was the point of keeping him alive? Supposedly sources tell us that Cortés cried when Moctezuma died, but he must have not been that bent out of shape, because he didn't really waste too long crying before he ordered all the other Mexica lords who had been captive to be executed. The Mexica responded by sending him an unambiguous message. They said, "Now you shall indeed pay for the death of our king and lord, and for your insults to our gods." During this lull in the fighting, there were women coming into the plazas with torches, looking for their husbands, in case they had been killed during the day's fighting. And if they found their bodies, they would just cry really loudly in a way that scared the Spaniards. The next day, the Spaniards tried to make a breakthrough through the city to reach the mainland. They quickly realized there was no way to do it. They were running low on gunpowder, food, and water. Lots of the Tlaxcalans with them had died in the fighting. So the Spaniards tried to bluff, and they said to the Mexica, "Look, let us retire. Give us 8 days. We'll get ready, and in 8 days we'll leave the city, okay?" Not because they really believed that the Mexica would let them go. It was more to give them the sense that they would need time to leave the city, whereas the Spanish plan was to try to flee during that same night, when perhaps the Mexica guard would be lowered a little bit. So Cortés' plan is to try to escape at midnight of June 30th, going into July 1st, which incidentally is the same date in which I'm recording this episode. This will be released later in July, but I just realized it's almost midnight now, and it is exactly that date. This, however, was in 1520. Now, that night is a good one to try to make the escape, because there's super heavy rain is pounding Tenochtitlan, and under cover of darkness, with everybody being quiet, nobody saying a word, the Spaniards, their native allies, they all try to slowly make their way out of the palace and make their escape. They have built these portable wooden bridges to use in those gaps in the last remaining causeway that was not, the Mexica had removed big sections from most of the other causeways, but there was one that was still mostly functional toward Tacuba. 400 Tlaxcalans and 50 Spanish soldiers carried this big wooden bridge, and the idea was to guard it while all the army would use it to get through. Sandoval and Ordaz had been ordered that if fighting broke out, they would be in the front. They would also, there were another 100 men under Francisco de Saucedo and Francisco de Lugo. They were to rush wherever there would be an attack. Cortés, Alonso de Avila, and Olid would be in the middle, and Alvarado and Velázquez would be in the rear guard. The Mexica are clearly slacking tonight, because they had not set up sentries to watch the palace, which you figure is a pretty elementary thing to do, but apparently they had maybe it was just raining too hard or something, but they had neglected to do it. So the Spaniards emerged from their hideout, crossed the deserted city undetected since everybody's barricaded inside, and they were about to cross the lake when a woman who had stepped out of her house to go get water saw them and screamed, "Mexica, come quickly, our enemies are leaving. Now that is night, they are running away." Within seconds after that, a priest from the top of the temple of Huitzilopochtli began screaming, "Mexica chiefs, your enemies are leaving. Run to your war canoes." Started pounding the drums to sound the alarm, so people jumped out of bed, got their weapons, and got in the canoes, ready to chase wherever the Spaniards would be. Some of the Spaniards had managed to get through. Cortés, Sandoval, and Olid had reached Tacuba by now. They left Malincin there with some of the others, but Cortés turned around to help because most of his men were still making their way along the causeway that was now under attack. Say what you will about Cortés, he probably lacked in many qualities that make one a decent human being, But one thing he did not lack was bravery. There's no argument that the guy was insanely brave. The Mexica canoes are attacking from everywhere. You have the Spaniards on, picture like this long road connecting the mainland to Tenochtitlan, the island in the middle. And, canoes are attacking from the left and the right. Spaniards some of them are falling in the water, having fallen from broken bridges. Bernal Diaz said, "Although 6 of my companions were wounded, we cut and hacked our way through." A certain Alonso de Escobar was riding a horse with a lot of gold packed there, but he disappeared and no one saw him again. Most likely he was killed. There were so many people in the water, both Mexica were swimming from the canoes reaching the Spaniards. Spaniards who had fallen from the bridge as a result of the fighting. There were so many people in the water that, as Bernal Diaz says, the channel was soon filled up with dead horses, Indians of both sexes, servants, bundles, and boxes. The canal was completely filled with them, and those who came last crossed over only on men, only on bodies. In other words, the carnage was such in this battle that in order to escape, Spaniards and Tlaxcalans had to walk on the bodies of the dead, quite literally. Quite a few Spaniards had stuffed way too much gold in their clothes, trying to carry it away, that when they were thrown off the bridges or they fell off, they drowned because all the gold was weighing them down. Cortés himself fell into the water and was surrounded by a group of Mexica ready to carry him off, but Cristobal de Olea and Antonio de Quiñones came to his rescue. I think I may have mentioned earlier in a previous episode there was a certain Maria de Estrada, who was one of the lone Spanish women with the expedition, who was apparently very skilled with the sword and fought really well in this battle. A couple of Moctezuma's, I think one of his sons and one of his daughters, were killed during the fighting. Alvarado was wounded. He had his horse was killed, and when Alvarado got to see Cortés, he told him that Juan Velázquez de León had died on the bridge along with many others, and he himself had escaped only by walking on dead men, horses, and eventually had to use his spear as a... This is actually kind of a funny image. He got trapped on one side of the causeway, then there was a spot that was broken where there was only water, and so in order to reach the other side of the bridge, Alvarado used his spear to pole vault to the other side. Some in the Spanish rearguard realized that while a good chunk of Spaniards had managed to reach the mainland, they were too far back, and there was no way they could get through by now, because there were just too many Mexicas, so they went back to the palace. But only a day or two later they were all captured and sacrificed. To make matters worse, there were actually a group of Spaniards that, somebody had been in charge to go through the different sections of the palace to wake everybody up, to say, okay, it's time to go, we are leaving now. But apparently somebody had forgotten. So there were actually a group of Spaniards in a different part of the palace who never heard the call that it was time to go. So they never got the message, remained behind, only to be also captured and sacrificed. Can you imagine that one guy who had the job to go tell everybody, hey, we need to go now? It's like you had one job. Really, that's the thing you forget? It seemed like an important one to forget to warn a whole bunch of your comrades. So quite a few Spaniards were sacrificed. Their heads and the heads of the horses were placed on the skull racks by the temple. All in all, by the time the battle was done, it's estimated that probably more than 600 Spaniards were killed. Plus, in some estimates suggest even as high as 865 Spaniards and over 1,000 Tlaxcalans. So what we're looking at is at least 2/3 of Cortés' forces were wiped out in this one-night battle. Less than 500 Spaniards survived. and only 23 horses survived, which is kind of a big deal since the Spaniards relied on their cavalry so much. By all measures, the Mexica had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Spaniards. Any rational individual would have concluded that the Spanish gamble to take over the Mexica Empire had miserably failed. It was over. This was it. This whole event, this battle, is what the Spaniards would refer to as La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night, because clearly things were not working very well for them by the end of tonight. 2/3 of them died. They got kicked out of the city. The Mexica are now ready and willing to fight. They are no longer being held back by Moctezuma. Cortés alone, however, seemed unaffected and never seemed to waver in his determination to take the empire. He was a man possessed. The one thing he asked when they got to the other side and they realized, okay, well, at least the 500 or so of us who are left, we did manage to escape. Good, pat on the back. The one thing he wanted to know, he asked if a certain Martin Lopez was still alive. Martin Lopez was the man who had built the boats who had been burned by the Mexica. And that was the only guy whom Cortés asked about. After finding out that he was wounded but alive, Cortés replied, well, let's go, for we lack nothing. He had already lost most of his men, his horses, the gold, most of his allies, and yet he said, we lack nothing. There's clearly a very fine line between genius and insanity. But the man had a plan, and Martin Lopez would play a big important role in it. So upon finding out that Lopez was safe and alive, Cortés was like, okay, great, then that's all we need. The Mexica thought the Spaniards were crushed for good. Many of the people who had humiliating them daily for the past few months were now dead in the street of Tenochtitlan and in the mud of the lake, along with much of the gold, the papers from Velázquez, and most other Spanish documents. For the Mexica, this moment meant freedom. This night was what they had been waiting for. So, this was as big of a victory as they could score. This was their chance to get their lives back. I picture them, after the few surviving Spaniards left, I picture them dancing in the streets, jumping for joy, hugging each other in the rain. The next day, everyone went out to collect all the things and their allies had lost during the escape. Weapons, gold, you name it. The Mexica thought that this was the last they saw of the Spaniards, which is reasonable considering that they just wiped out the biggest part of the whole army, as well as their allies. But the one thing that the Mexica had not taken into account was Cortés' luck and his borderline manic unwillingness to take no for an answer. As long as he drew breath, he would keep trying. And trying again to conquer the Mexica Empire, he will, in the fourth and last episode of this History on Fire series.